November arrived at the Bitterroot Valley the way it always did, not as a gradual cooling, but as a verdict. One morning the peaks above were bare granite and amber scrub. The next they wore white down to the tree line, and every homesteader between Stevensville and the confluence of Sleeping Child Creek understood what that white line meant. It was a clock. It was a countdown. It was the land's way of asking whether you had done enough. Along the main wagon road that cut through the valley floor, the answer was visible in the woodpiles. Families measured their readiness in cord upon cord of split timber stacked against cabin walls and barn sides and fence rails, great walls of lodgepole pine and Douglas fir and river birch that rose 6, 7, 8 feet high, covered in canvas and bark sheeting dense enough to cast real shadows across dooryards in the pale October sun. Some of the older homesteaders had so much wood stacked that a stranger riding through might wonder if they were building something rather than burning something. A man named Patterson on the north side of the road had 16 feet of cord stacked in an L shape against his barn, and his neighbors did not think this excessive. They thought it prudent. Winter in western Montana did not negotiate. It did not offer extensions. It arrived with full authority, and it collected what it was owed from anyone who had miscalculated. At the far end of the wagon road, where the creek bent sharply north and the lodgepole pines gave way to open meadow, there was a cabin, small, built from rough-hewn logs, a stone chimney, leaning slightly eastward as if listening for something. One window facing south, its glass wavy and imperfect, the kind ordered from a catalog 3 years before anyone imagined living in this particular valley. A small shed behind the cabin, its roof sagging on the left side. A lean-to that served as a windbreak. And in front of the cabin, along the wall where every other homestead in the valley displayed its winter ambitions in stacked timber, there was almost nothing. A modest pile of split wood, maybe a week's worth if the weather stayed mild. Loose kindling in a crate near the door, and silence where the sound of a splitting maul should have been ringing out from dawn until the light failed. Nobody who passed that cabin in early October understood what they were seeing. They thought they understood it. A woman alone, recently widowed, unprepared. A homestead that would go cold before Christmas. A situation that would resolve itself, as such situations always did, with someone riding out in December to find the worst and having to send back for help. They discussed it at the trading post in Stevensville, the men gathering for supplies, and the conversation finding its way there the way water found the low point in any terrain. The widow Whitmore, hardly any wood. She won't make it to Thanksgiving without knocking on someone's door. What none of them could see, because it had not yet become visible, was what Clara Whitmore was actually doing with her time. She was 34 years old in October of 1878, 9 months a widow, and she had not spent a single one of those months in grief's paralysis. James Whitmore had died in February, a logging accident, the kind that happened when a felled tree pivoted wrong, and there was no running from it, and by March Clara had made her accounting. She had a quarter section of land James had filed on 3 years prior. She had a cabin he had mostly finished before the accident, which meant she had walls and a roof and a door that closed against wind. She had the knowledge her father had given her and the discipline her mother had shown her, and the memory of a particular afternoon in Michigan when she was 13 years old that had lodged itself in the back of her mind like a splinter, small, persistent, impossible to ignore. She had not come to Montana by accident or by sentiment. She had come because James had come, and she had stayed because the land was hers now, and because retreating to Michigan would have meant accepting that the land had defeated her, rather than simply that the land had taken James. Clara Whitmore did not accept defeat. She examined it, measured it, and worked around it. Her father had been a surveyor, a man who spent his working life reading terrain the way other men read newspapers for information, for patterns, for what the landscape was trying to tell anyone patient enough to listen. He had raised Clara to look at the ground before she looked at the sky, to assess drainage and soil composition and slope angle before she decided where to plant or build or dig. He said the earth was honest in a way that people rarely were. The earth told you exactly where the water went. It told you where the frost held longest. It told you which hillside would stay firm under load and which would shift in spring. You only had to learn its language, and its language was physical, the color of clay versus sand, the sound a spade made hitting different substrates, the way frost heaved certain soils and left others untouched. Clara's mother had given her something different and equally essential. Elizabeth Whitmore née Caldwell had been a school teacher in the Upper Peninsula before she married a woman who spoke 3 languages and kept meticulous accounts in a ledger she never allowed the children to touch, and who could calculate board feet of lumber in her head faster than most men with pencil and paper. She believed that mathematics was a form of respect for resources, for time, for the people, depending on the same finite supply of both. She taught Clara to count what she had before she spent it. She taught her to estimate what she would need before winter rather than discover the shortfall during it. She taught her that a woman who could do arithmetic was harder to fool and harder to break than a woman who could not. Between these 2 educations, Clara had built a mind that was at once imaginative and precise. She could visualize a system before she built it and then test the visualization against physical reality with a calibrated eye. It was not a common set of skills. It was not one that anyone riding past her cabin in October of 1878 would have guessed she possessed. But it was the set of skills that was quietly saving her life while her neighbors stacked cord after cord of wood that the rain was already beginning to compromise. In September, when the aspens along the creek bottoms turned gold and the temperature began dropping after sunset with the seriousness of a door closing, Clara had done 2 things before she thought about firewood at all. She had walked her property from the south boundary to the north, and she had looked at the ground. She was looking for a specific combination, the hillside with sufficient slope for natural drainage, south-facing for minimal frost depth, subsoil of dense clay, or clay mixed gravel that would hold stable temperatures without shifting, and a position that placed the structure at least 30 feet from the cabin, far enough for safety, close enough for practicality. She found it on the east side of her property, where a modest rise broke the flat meadow floor. The soil there turned dark and slick, about 18 inches down, the kind of dense clay that sat in your spade like cold butter. Below that glacial cobble, rounded stones the size of fists, deposited by ice sheets that had retreated 10,000 years before anyone named this valley. She had seen something like this hillside once before. The memory came to her clearly, the way important memories did when the conditions finally made them relevant. She had been 13 traveling with her father on a surveying contract in Keweenaw County in Michigan's Upper Peninsula in the late summer of 1857. The contract took them to a remote section of land near the county's southern boundary, and her father had arranged to spend a night at a homestead owned by a man named Elias Garnett, an old miner who had worked the copper lodes for 20 years before giving it up for farming. Garnett was 68 that summer, a lean man with hands so calloused they looked like they were wearing gloves made of skin, and he had spent so many winters in the Upper Peninsula that he had arrived at certain conclusions about cold and fuel and storage that no manual had taught him. After supper, he had led Clara's father and Clara herself out behind the cabin to where a low hillside rose from the meadow, and he had crouched near the base of it and pulled open a wooden hatch set flush with the ground. Her father had peered in and said with the polite skepticism of an educated man confronting something he had not encountered before, "Root cellar," and Garnet had shaken his head. "Not vegetables, wood." Clara's father had straightened and looked at Garnet with the expression of a man who suspects a joke and is waiting for the punchline. Garnet gestured them both down the short ramp into the chamber below. It was dim inside, lit only by the hatch above and a narrow gap near the roof, and Clara's eyes had adjusted slowly to reveal rows of split timber stacked from floor to ceiling, with careful precision, each row separated from the next by small gaps the width of a finger. The air inside was cool, but not cold dry, in a way that outdoor air in late summer was never dry. She had reached out and pressed her palm flat against the nearest log, without thinking about it the way a child touches anything that interests her before she has developed the adult habit of restraint. The wood was completely, definitively dry. Not surface dry while holding frost in its core. Dry all the way through, the way seasoned wood stored in a barn through August felt dry, light, and clean and ready. This was not August. This was late September in Michigan, and outside that hatch the nights were already touching freezing. Garnet explained it to her father in the practical shorthand of a man who had figured something out through experience rather than theory, and who no longer felt the need to dress his conclusions in more language than they required. The earth below the frost line, roughly 3 to 4 feet in Keweenaw County, depending on the winter, maintained a stable temperature year-round. In that part of Michigan, that temperature ran between 45 and 55 degrees Fahrenheit. Not warm, not cold, precisely and reliably in between. "No wind here," Garnet said, and swept his arm at the enclosed space. "No wet, no freeze. Ground does the work. You just have to build the room and let the ground do it." Her father had asked about rot, about moisture, about the wood absorbing water from the surrounding soil. Garnet had pointed to the ventilation gap near the roof, explained the drainage trench he had dug along the outside of the structure, described the dense clay substrate that held temperature without shifting and did not wick moisture the way sandy soil would. "Ventilate right, drain right, choose your ground right," he said. "And wood stays like this all winter, like you cut it last July." Clara's father had nodded in the non-committal way of a man who found the argument technically plausible, but would not have tried it himself, being constitutionally disinclined toward unconventional approaches to conventional problems. Clara had said nothing. She was 13, and children did not insert themselves into conversations between their fathers and other men. But she had pressed her hand against that dry log one more time before they climbed back out into the evening air, and she had filed the sensation somewhere permanent. 21 years later, standing on a low-rise in the Bitterroot Valley of Montana Territory, with a spade in her hands and the smell of frost beginning to develop in the September air, she retrieved it. She started digging in the first week of September, several weeks before the aspen leaves had even begun to turn. This was not caution for its own sake. This was arithmetic. She calculated the volume of the chamber she needed, estimated the daily progress she could make in dense clay and glacial cobble with a mattock, a spade, and an iron pry bar, accounted for the variability in ground composition she might encounter, and arrived at a timeline that told her she needed to begin no later than the 1st of September if she wanted the chamber finished and filled before the first hard freeze locked the topsoil and made the last stages of construction miserable. She allowed herself 3 weeks of excavation and another 3 of filling, and she began digging. Her nearest neighbor, Edmund Holt, saw her working one afternoon in the first week of October. He had been hauling timber with his 2 sons, William and George, and they had stopped to water the horses at the creek that crossed the lower edge of Edmund's property. From there, across the flat meadow, you could see Clara's rise, and the figure working at its base. Edmund shaded his eyes and watched for a moment. William, his younger son at 14, squinted in the same direction and offered, "She's digging a grave." Edmund told him no, too wide at the entrance, wrong shape for a grave. His older son George asked what it was then. Edmund watched the figure work for another moment, the rhythmic lift and swing and release of someone making methodical progress through resistant material, and said nothing because he genuinely did not know. The question stayed with him through the rest of the afternoon in the imprecise way that small mysteries do, not urgent, not forgotten, just present. What Clara was building had no name in any farming manual circulating in western Montana in 1878. There was no blueprint for it in any carpentry guild publication or agricultural journal. She was working from the memory of a 68-year-old man explaining something to her father on a September evening in Michigan, while she stood very still and listened with more attention than she had ever given a classroom lesson. She worked outward from that memory, adapting for the specifics of Montana terrain and Montana weather, and the particular composition of the soil on the east side of her property. The chamber itself was 10 feet deep into the hillside, 8 feet wide and 6 feet tall, at the center ridge just sufficient for her to stand fully upright without the top of her head brushing the dirt ceiling. She excavated it horizontally, not vertically, driving the cut into the slope rather than down into the earth, so that the chamber's back wall sat deeper underground than its entrance. This angle was not incidental. It was the mechanism by which any groundwater that found its way into the chamber would flow toward the entrance and out rather than pooling in the back where the wood would sit. She cut the floor with a slight forward pitch for the same reason. The entrance shaft descended 5 steps at a gentle angle, reinforced with salvaged timber from an old flume she had found collapsed in the brush at the south edge of her property. Heavy weathered wood that had already proven its resistance to moisture and would not warp when set against damp earth. She positioned the entrance on the downslope side of the rise so that the natural drainage of the hillside would carry surface water away from the opening rather than toward it. She dug a shallow trench along the outside of the entrance, curving it away from the slope as an additional insurance. The ventilation gaps were the most critical element and the most easily misunderstood. She cut 2 of them near the roof of the chamber, one on each side, each about 3 inches wide, and covered with a wooden grate she made from split lath, the spacing tight enough to block most debris and deter small animals, but open enough to allow air to move. Too much ventilation, and you pulled outdoor air in with all its attendant moisture and temperature instability. Too little, and the air inside the chamber would stagnate, and stagnant air in an enclosed earthen space grew damp. The gaps she cut were sized to allow slow exchange, the kind of gentle, continuous circulation that kept the interior air fresh without drawing in weather. By the middle of the second week of October, Guy had finished most of the excavation, but she had not finished alone. In the second week, she had hit a section of glacial cobble in the back of the chamber that her pry bar could move only in small, exhausting increments. A man named Silas Monroe arrived at her door that same week, a well digger by trade, traveling between settlements in the valley looking for work before winter closed down the outdoor labor market entirely. He had strong arms and a practical approach to unusual requests, both of which Clara needed. She offered him 4 days of meals and a dry place to sleep in exchange for his help with the difficult section, and she said nothing about what the structure was for. He did not ask. He was the kind of man who understood that people who hired him by the day to dig in their ground were paying him for his arms and his silence in roughly equal measure. He swung the mattock against the cobble section with an efficiency that Clara watched carefully, learning the angle of attack he used to find the joints between stones rather than striking the stones themselves. In 4 days, they cleared the back wall of the chamber, set the final framing timbers, and installed the grating over the ventilation gaps. When Monroe finished the agreed work, he had planned to continue south, but the season had other ideas. The wages he had expected from a family near the valley's southern end fell through when that family departed for Missoula ahead of the cold, and the early frost that arrived in mid-October made the road south less appealing than waiting out a few weeks in the valley. He found a small rented cabin at the road's midpoint and took on odd repair work through November, staying longer than he had intended and settling into the rhythms of a place the way transient men sometimes did when a place offered enough warmth and enough work to make departure feel less urgent than arrival. He stopped at the trading post in Stevensville during that first week, and in the course of the conversation that developed around the stove, he mentioned that the widow Whitmore at the end of the road had him dig something into the hillside. He described it as a hatch with a room behind it, but said he did not know what she intended to store there, having not been told. The men at the trading post offered various theories. One suggested she was preparing a root cellar and simply did not want to say so, there being nothing unusual about a root cellar. Another proposed she was burying valuables, money perhaps, or items from her husband's estate. A third, with the confident certainty of a man who rarely questioned his own speculations, decided she was building some kind of storm shelter, preparation for a disaster she had perhaps been warned about by someone more connected to territorial weather reports than ordinary homesteaders. Nobody suggested she was storing firewood underground. The idea did not present itself because it had no precedent in their collective experience. People stored firewood outside covered with canvas and bark. That was where firewood went. The notion that it might go elsewhere, that there might be a better arrangement than the one everyone had always used, did not arise. The theory about the storm shelter is the one that circulated most widely, and this suited Clara perfectly without her having done anything to encourage it. Misinformation she had learned from her father was most effective when it arrived without your assistance. Through the last 10 days of October, she moved wood. She had spent the summer preparing for this, not visibly, not in a way that attracted comment, but with the same precision she brought to everything. The lodgepole pine she had split in June was stacked in a row near the south wall of her shed, exposed to full afternoon sun, which in Montana's dry summer air produced wood that was genuinely seasoned, rather than surface dry and damp inside, which was a condition of most wood that homesteaders called ready. The Douglas fir she had worked in July was slightly heavier, denser, and would burn longer. The river birch split thin was the wood she planned for overnight. It caught quickly, released heat at a steady rate, and burned down to coals that held warmth for hours. She had separated these by type because they served different functions, and she intended to stack them in the chamber accordingly. She loaded the wheelbarrow and moved it along the path she had worn between the woodpile and the chamber entrance, tilting it down the ramp and releasing the logs one by one onto the chamber floor. She stacked them with deliberate gaps, not the tight interlocking stacks she had seen on every homestead in the valley, which were structurally impressive but prevented air from moving between individual pieces. She stacked them loosely, the gaps roughly the width of her hand, so that what circulated inside the chamber could circulate between the wood as well, keeping each piece dry from all surfaces rather than just the exposed face. 3 weeks of this work, moving wood and wheelbarrow loads across the meadow grass each morning until the temperature climbed enough to work without her breath fogging, and each afternoon until the light failed. The chamber filled slowly, the way anything real fills, not in a dramatic moment, but through accumulation. By the 3rd week of October, she had moved nearly 3 cords inside. She stood in the chamber and looked at what she had done at the rows of split timber, receding toward the back wall in the dim light from the ventilation gaps and the open hatch above, and she did not feel proud exactly. She felt accurate. She had estimated what she would need, and she had provided it. The emotion that accompanied accuracy in her experience was not pride but something quieter, a kind of readiness. The hatch she built last after the chamber was filled. 2 layers of planking with a 3-inch gap between them, the gap creating a crude but effective insulating barrier against the cold that would descend on the exterior surface. The outer face she covered with a section of sod she had cut from the meadow and kept moist through the dry weeks, pressing it down over the planking and packing earth around the edges until the hatch sat flush with the hillside and the grass on its surface browning now, with the season matched the grass around it. She attached a leather strap to the underside doubled and stitched that she could grip from below to pull the hatch closed after she descended. 30 feet from her front door, she built a small cairn of 3 stones that she would be able to locate under any depth of snow, and that to anyone who noticed it would suggest nothing more than the habit of a person who moved rocks out of her path. From the road, her homestead looked underprepared in a way that felt almost aggressive. Edmund Holt passed it on a Tuesday morning in late October with a load of hay on his wagon bed, and stopped his team to look at what Clara had outside. The woodpile near her shed, the visible one, the decoy, the thing she had left there specifically because its absence would have prompted immediate and intrusive intervention, was modest. He estimated 6, maybe 8 days' worth if the cold held steady, and she was conservative with the stove. He had stacked his own wood through September and the first 2 weeks of October, while full cords in a row, along the north wall of his barn, covered in canvas, weighted with stones along the edges. His sons had complained about the work. He had told them the complaining could stop when the complaining paid for firewood, which it did not. He watched Clara's cabin for a moment, then shook his reins and continued on toward Stevensville. But the image of that thin woodpile stayed with him the way small wrong things do, neither urgent nor dismissible. By November, the talking had acquired a specific quality, not speculative anymore, but declarative, as if the conclusion had already been reached and only the date of its confirmation was still pending. At the trading post, men picking up flour and salt and lamp oil would mention the Whitmore place in the same tone they might use for a leaky boat. There was no question about what would happen, only about when. Some of them felt genuinely sorry. A few made practical offers of assistance that were sincere and based in the real frontier custom of looking after your neighbors regardless of whether they deserved it. Edmund Holt was among these. He loaded a half-cord of his split pine onto his wagon one afternoon in the second week of November. Good dry lodgepole covered with his best canvas through September, and drove it out to Clara's place and stacked it himself along the side of her shed without being asked. Clara thanked him from the doorway with a genuine warmth that had nothing performative about it. She said she was managing fine. He told her the wood was there if she needed it and drove home, and in the simple accounting he did before sleep, that night he put the action in the category of things that cost him something and were worth it regardless of outcome. 7 days later, he drove past her place on the way to check a fence line at the eastern edge of his property. The wood was exactly as he had stacked it, every piece in place. The canvas corner he had left tucked under the bottom row, still tucked under the bottom row. If she had taken a single log from that pile in the week since he left it, the evidence was not visible. He told his wife about it that evening. Martha Holt was a practical woman who had been married to Edmund long enough to know when he was working towards something and had not yet arrived there. She let him finish describing it and looked out the kitchen window toward the south, where on a clear night you could see the faint orange suggestion of Clara Whitmore's lamp through her south-facing window. Then she said the thing that settled on both of them like cold air finding a gap in the wall. Either she's sitting in a cold house because she's too proud to touch it, or she's sitting in a warm house because she doesn't need it. She paused. I don't think it's the first one. Edmund looked at the window for a moment. He did not think it was the first one either. Thomas Reardon arrived at Edmund's place on a Wednesday evening near the end of November. The way he usually arrived, unannounced, practical, not quite a social visit and not quite a business call, but something useful in between. Reardon was a freighter, 42 years old, and he spent enough time moving between Missoula and the Bitterroot settlements to have developed a detailed map in his head of which homesteads were well run and which were struggling, and at what rate information he never shared frivolously, but which occasionally became relevant in ways that justified his habit of observation. He warmed his hands at Edmund's stove and accepted coffee and said what he had come to say directly in the manner of a man who found indirect approaches wasteful. He had ridden past the Whitmore place 4 times in November. The first time he had noticed the modest woodpile and thought nothing particular of it beyond what everyone in the valley was already thinking. The second time he had noticed that the pile was the same size it had been the first time, which was not what you expected of a homestead burning wood against November cold. By the third time, he had started paying specific attention, watching the chimney, timing his passes for different hours of the day, noting the character of what rose from that eastward-leaning stone chimney. It was clean smoke, not the thick cream-colored billow of damp wood burning badly, but the narrow, transparent column that meant bone-dry fuel combusting completely at high temperature. He knew that distinction, the way he knew the sound of a well-balanced wheel versus one about to fail from years of having things go wrong when he did not pay attention. She's burning clean, he told Edmund. Burning hot and clean every time I go past, and I cannot account for where the wood is coming from. Edmund wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. He told Reardon about the half-cord he had stacked against the shed and the fact that 7 days later it had not been touched. Reardon went quiet for a moment, which for a man who was already economical with words represented something close to meditation. Then he looked at Edmund and said, "Something doesn't add up." Edmund said he knew it. Reardon said he didn't like things that didn't add up, not because they threatened him. Clara Whitmore staying warm was a good outcome regardless of the mechanism, but because the gap between what he could observe and what he could explain bothered him the way a loose board underfoot bothered him, not dangerous precisely, but wrong and likely to become dangerous if not understood. Reardon left an hour later, heading back toward his place on the north side of the valley, and Edmund sat at his kitchen table in the quiet that good conversations leave behind them, and ran the numbers again. Clara's cabin was 300 square feet, maybe a little less. A small, tight space with a single stove that she had clearly been running at high efficiency. A cabin that size in this cold required roughly a quarter cord per week to stay livable, assuming good dry fuel and an efficient burn. That was the absolute floor. If the wood was damp or frozen, you burned more and heated less, and the equation turned against you fast. She did not have enough visible wood to account for the weeks she had clearly been burning at that rate. He was not wrong about this. He was good at these calculations. His father had been good at them, and he had learned the way you learned useful things from capable people by watching, by practicing, and by being corrected when the math came out different from what the physical reality showed. He was still wrong about something, though. He just did not know what it was yet. Outside, the temperature had dropped to single digits by midnight. The cold that particular November produced was not the theatrical cold of blizzard and whiteout, But the grinding, patient cold of clear skies and still air, the kind that drained heat from structures through their walls and ceilings, slowly and inexorably, the way water found its way through stone not by force but by persistence. Families across the valley were burning through their reserves faster than they had expected, which was the same thing that happened every year when the first real cold arrived, and the calculations made in September proved to have been optimistic. Wood that had seemed like plenty in October looked different in November when the temperature stopped climbing above 25 degrees at midday. At Clara Whitmore's cabin, the fire she built each morning from the wood she collected every third day burned hot and clean and gave her warmth without drama. She baked bread. She mended harness leather. She read by lamplight in the evenings and kept her accounts in a small ledger and considered what she would plant in April when the ground thawed. She was not comfortable in any luxurious sense. She was warm, which was the only thing that mattered, and she was not using more fuel than she had planned, which meant she would be warm in February too. What was under the hillside 30 feet from her front door was this rows of dry timber in cool, still air, sealed from weather and wind by 6 feet of earth on 3 sides, and the sod-covered hatch on the fourth maintained at a temperature that hovered between 45 and 50 degrees, by the simple fact that the earth itself at that depth did not experience winter. It did not experience summer either. It simply held the slow, accumulated heat of its own mass, the thermal inertia of a planetary object, expressing itself at the scale of a storage chamber. No freeze-thaw cycle moved through it. No rain reached it. No wind crossed it. The wood inside it rested in the same condition it had been in when Clara stacked it in October, and it would remain in that condition until she opened the hatch and carried it the 30 feet to her door. Every 3 days she did exactly this. She pulled on her coat and her boots and walked to the cairn and cleared whatever snow had accumulated, and pulled the hatch open by the leather strap and descended the 5 steps into the cool, dry quiet below. She filled a canvas sling with enough wood for 72 hours, not grabbing randomly, but choosing deliberately the mix of pine and fir and birch calculated for the weather she expected in the next 3 days, and she climbed back up and closed the hatch and walked back to her cabin. From a distance, to anyone watching, she appeared to be checking a snare line or retrieving something from storage. No one thought twice about it because there was nothing unusual to think twice about. A woman walking to a hillside and returning with a loaded sling was not a story. It was just a morning. The story, the real one, the one that mattered, was underground where the wood waited. December was 2 weeks away. The peaks above the valley were white to their bases now, the line of permanent snow having descended through October and November until it sat at the elevation of the highest homesteads. At Edmund Holt's place, the canvas over his woodpile had developed a tear along the north edge where the wind had worked at it, and 2 days of cold rain in mid-October had gotten into the bottom 3 rows before he noticed and repaired the damage. The wood was not ruined, but it was not what it had been in September, and he had started to feel the difference when he loaded the stove in the mornings. More kindling required more time before the firebox reached the temperature at which the primary wood would catch and sustain itself. He did not mention this to anyone. Neither did Thomas Reardon, who was discovering similar things about the cords he had stacked near his barn, in a location he now recognized as marginally too low for good drainage. They were burning through reserves faster than planned, and the brutal cold that everyone in the valley had learned to expect between December and February had not yet arrived. The valley did not know yet what it was looking at. It would learn. But first, winter had to arrive in earnest and show everyone, the skeptics, the concerned, the dismissive, and the genuinely well-meaning, what the difference between preparation and the appearance of preparation actually felt like when the mercury stopped climbing and the cold settled in like a tenant who had nowhere else to go. The rains came in the third week of October, and they came without drama or warning. Not the theatrical storm that announces itself with thunder and a darkening sky, but the quiet, methodical kind that begins as mist and thickens by degrees until you realize you have been standing in real rain for an hour without noticing the transition. In the Bitterroot Valley that year, the rain lasted 14 days. Not continuous, not unbroken, but persistent, clearing for half a day, returning for a full one, leaving the ground saturated and the air permanently damp in a way that did not resolve even on the days when the sun appeared. It was the kind of rain that had no theatrical ambition. It simply arrived and stayed and did its work. The work it did on every exposed woodpile in the valley was slow and comprehensive, and essentially invisible until the temperature dropped. Canvas tarps collected standing water in their low points and transferred it through seams and gaps to the wood beneath. Bark sheeting, which most homesteaders use it as a secondary cover, absorbed moisture along its edges and held it against whatever it touched. The bottom rows of every stack, the rows sitting closest to ground that had grown progressively wetter, drew water upward through capillary action in a process so gradual that no single day showed dramatic evidence of it. The wood looked the same. It felt the same, largely to a hand pressed quickly against its surface. What had changed was inside, in the cellular structure of the wood fiber itself, where water had found the channels that living wood used to carry sap and had settled into them as the slow cold of late October encouraged it to stay. Nobody understood the full extent of the problem yet, because wood soaked in October rain does not reveal its condition until you try to burn it in December. The revelation, when it came, would be simultaneous and valley-wide and unpleasant. Clara had known the rains were coming the way her father had taught her, to know it not from any specific forecast or weather sign, but from the logic of the terrain and the season. She had grown up in a place where mountains forced moisture-laden air upward, where compressed air cooled and dropped its water on the western slopes and the valleys below them, and where October in particular was the month of reckoning for anyone who had made assumptions about what the sky would do. She had not assumed anything. She had built her storage system on the premise that what was outside in October would be wet, and that wet wood stored for a Montana winter was a liability dressed as an asset. Her wood had been underground and sealed behind a sod-covered hatch before the first day of rain. The 14 days that followed were not a crisis for her. They were a confirmation. What she could not have fully anticipated was the bear. It happened on a Tuesday evening in the first week of November. The sky already dark by 5 o'clock and the temperature sitting at 18 degrees, with the particular stillness of that clear sky cold produced air so motionless that sound carried strange distances, and the creak of a tree settling in the cold seemed to come from directly beside you, even when the source was 100 yards away. Clara was walking the 30 feet between her door and the cairn to make her every third-day collection, a canvas sling over one shoulder and a small lantern in her hand, when she heard the sound. It was not dramatic. It was the specific sound of something heavy moving in the dry grass and dead meadow growth near the base of the rise, accompanied by a wet, investigative snuffling that identified its source before the lantern beam found it. The black bear was not large, as black bears in western Montana went young probably, and not yet in full hibernation, operating in the half-stupor of an animal that had not yet found adequate conditions for denning. It was positioned near the rock pile cairn forepaws, working at the earth around the base of the hatch, nose tracking whatever had come through the ventilation gap in the roof of the chamber below. The smell of pine resin and split Douglas fir concentrated inside the enclosed space and slowly exhaling through the narrow openings had apparently been compelling enough from across the meadow to bring 230 pounds of curious animal directly to the one spot on Clara's property she needed undisturbed. She stood still for 3 seconds, which was the amount of time her mind required to move from recognition to assessment to decision. Running was wrong, her father had told her this, and she had filed it as information and now retrieved it as instruction. A retreating figure activated a different response in a bear than a stationary or advancing one. She had no rifle in her hands, and the one inside the cabin was too far. She had the lantern and the canvas sling, and the physical fact of her own body, which could be made either smaller or larger depending on which she chose. She made it larger. She put the canvas sling on the ground, took the lantern in both hands, and walked directly toward the bear while simultaneously picking up a length of split wood from the few pieces she kept stacked near the cairn for easy access, and striking it against the lantern's metal housing with a sharp, repeated clang, the most unnatural sound she could produce with what she had. The bear lifted its head. Its ears went up and then back. It was young enough to be uncertain about what it was confronting, which was the variable she was counting on. She kept walking and kept striking the metal, closing the distance in the slow, deliberate way that announced intention without panic. The bear shifted its weight backward. Then it turned and moved away into the dark meadow with the unhurried certainty of an animal that had decided somewhere else was more interesting, rather than one that had been driven off. She watched the darkness for another 3 minutes before she trusted its stillness. When she went below into the chamber and loaded the sling for the next 3 days, she found nothing damaged. The hatch had not been breached, the ventilation grating was intact. But crouching near the roof and putting her face close to the grating, she could smell what the bear had been tracking. The pine resin was stronger than she had intended, a concentrated draft that the still November air was carrying away from the hill. She considered this carefully. The grating itself was adequate against debris and weather. Against smell, it was nothing. She climbed back out and gathered a double handful of dry meadow grass from the growth along the rise and pressed it into the grating openings, packing it loosely enough that air still moved through the gaps, were small enough that even a light packing created meaningful resistance to odor transmission without choking off circulation. She did the same to both sides. Then she climbed back down and confirmed that the faint interior draft she could feel against her palm was unchanged in direction and roughly similar in volume. The bear did not return. Clara rebuilt the grass packing after every visit and checked it every morning from her south window. On the days she did not go to the chamber, and the disturbed earth around the hatch resealed under a week's worth of light, snowfall and freeze-thaw cycling, until by the end of November there was nothing visible from 6 feet away that indicated anything was there at all. The problem had been real. The solution had cost her an hour of work and a handful of meadow grass, and the system had come through it more robust than it had entered. This was how she thought about most problems, not as evidence of flawed design, but as information about what the design needed. December arrived the way experienced homesteaders knew it would eventually arrive, not as a worsening of what November had already brought, but as a different thing entirely. November was cold. December in a hard year was something that had its own name in the language of the land, something that did not borrow from the ordinary vocabulary of weather. The storm system began as a low-pressure area moving south out of Canada on the 10th day of December, tracking down the western side of the Rockies before turning east into the Valley Corridor. It picked up moisture from the Snake River Plain as it moved and arrived over the Bitterroot Valley, carrying both heavy wet snow and the promise of the temperature drop that would follow it. For 3 days the snow fell, not the light, dry, powdery snow of the high-altitude cold snaps, but the dense cement-wet snow that packed into drifts under its own weight and accumulated 2 feet where the drifts weren't and 5 feet where they were. Then on the morning of December 14th, the clouds cleared, and with them went the thermal blanket that snow cover provided, and the temperature fell the way a stone falls directly and with commitment. On the morning of December 15th, Edmund Holt went outside before sunrise to check his stock, and the glass tube of his thermometer showed the mercury contracted to a point below the last graduation mark, which represented 18 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit, which was as cold as the instrument could officially record. He stood on his porch for a moment looking at it, and then went back inside and told his wife they would not be leaving the property that day for any reason. By mid-morning, when the sun had been above the horizon for 3 hours, the temperature in the valley floor had climbed to roughly 0 degrees and was not climbing further. The air was absolutely still. Sound moved through it with unnatural clarity. Edmund could hear his horses in the barn from 50 feet away, their breathing and the occasional stamp of a foot on frozen ground sounds that normally would not have carried through closed barn walls. The sky was the color of polished tin, cloudless, offering light with no warmth, a sky that had used up everything it intended to give and was now simply present. Every family in the valley was burning wood at maximum rate, and the wood was not performing as expected. The problem that the October rains had seeded through every exposed woodpile in the Bitterroot Valley revealed itself now in the specific and irreversible way that concealed problems always reveal themselves at the worst possible time, under the worst possible conditions, with no remaining opportunity for correction. Logs that had been cool and damp in October were now frozen, not surface frozen, which would have been manageable, but frozen through to the cellular level. The water that had infiltrated the wood fiber now expanded into ice crystals that locked inside the material like rebar in concrete. The logs were heavier than they should have been. They required twice the kindling and 3 times the patience to catch, and when they caught, they burned at lower temperatures than dry wood because a significant portion of the energy being released went not to producing heat, but to melting the ice trapped inside the wood before the fire could reach the combustion temperature of the fiber itself. British thermal units that should have been warming cabins were being consumed at the firebox, instead doing invisible, thankless work before any of their effect could be felt in the rooms beyond. The smoke told the story for anyone willing to read it. From a distance, the chimneys of the homesteads that were burning frozen wood exhaled in thick, yellowish-white columns that drifted slowly in the still air and did not dissipate cleanly, the signature of incomplete combustion of fire. Working below its efficient temperature of creosote forming in the oven, cooled upper portions of the chimney stacks, where the inadequate heat could not keep the byproducts of combustion in vapor form. Inside those stacks, in the gaps between the stones or the seams of the clay mortar, a waxy black compound was accumulating, with each day's burning adding to deposits that had already been building since the season's first fire. It was this compound creosote that accounted for the chimney fires that began appearing in the valley in the 3rd week of December. Brief, intense combustions inside the chimney stack itself when the accumulated deposits reached ignition temperature, sending superheated gases and sparks up and out of the chimney mouth, and occasionally, depending on the roof's condition, finding their way to the wooden structures below. Silas Monroe, who had settled for the winter in the small cabin at the road's midpoint, had a chimney fire on the night of December 16th that woke his wife and their 2 daughters with the sound of a percussion inside the walls. They got out and stood in 15 degrees below 0, wearing what they had grabbed on the way out the door, and watched the sparks spiral from the chimney top and drop onto the roof boards. The fire stayed inside the chimney. By an hour's measure of luck and the moist snow that packed the roof, the structure did not catch. But the chimney was cracked through the mortar at 3 points, and Monroe spent the following day packing those cracks with wet clay mixed from the unfrozen soil near his spring box, working with bare hands in temperatures that turned his fingers white at the tips in 10 minutes, and cost him feeling in 2 of them that did not fully return until March. Thomas Reardon's situation had been deteriorating since the first severe cold arrived. His woodpile was positioned in a low section of his property near the barn, in a location he had chosen 3 years prior for proximity and convenience, and which had not revealed its drainage problems until an October wet enough to expose them. The bottom third of his stack, roughly 2 cords of the 6 he had assembled through September, was frozen solid in a way that made ordinary splitting impossible. He and his 2 sons spent the early days of the cold snap working through this wood with an iron wedge and a 10-pound sledgehammer, finding the grain lines by instinct, and striking along them, splitting each piece with effort that should have been divided among 5 times as many logs. The frozen wood resisted differently than dry wood. It had no give, none of the tensile elasticity that allowed a dry log to absorb a blow and transmit it to the grain before splitting. It absorbed the strike and then either split cleanly or exploded along an unexpected plane, sending a fragment across the yard at a velocity that made the work genuinely dangerous. His older son Daniel took a piece across the right forearm on the 3rd day that left a bruise running from wrist to elbow and put him off splitting for 2 days, during which Reardon and the younger boy managed the barn and the firewood together and slept fewer hours than they needed. The burn rate through his usable wood was nearly twice what he had planned for. The frozen logs, when he managed to split them and expose the drier core, burned at maybe 60% efficiency, enough to keep the cabin above freezing if they fed the stove constantly, not enough to produce the warmth that a functioning winter household required. His youngest child, Henry, had developed a cough on the 17th of December. Not immediately alarming colds were common in winter, particularly in children, and a cough meant mucus and irritation rather than automatically meaning something worse. But Henry was 7, and the cough was accompanied by a low fever, and the cabin was consistently 12 degrees colder than it should have been because the fuel could not do its job. Reardon had been watching the smoke from Clara Whitmore's chimney all month. He had made it a habit he did not explain to his wife or son, simply noting it each time he was outdoors. His freighter's eye, trained to assess cargo and load and the condition of equipment at a glance, told him the same thing every time: dry wood, hot fire, clean burn. No stress in that chimney, no creosote building, no half-temperature combustion producing the thick efflux that was coming from every other chimney in the valley, including his own. On the morning of December 19th, after 2 nights of interrupted sleep and a morning in which Henry's cough had produced a sound that had gone from dry to something wetter and more productive, in a way that pediatric experience told him was not good, Reardon put on his coat and walked to his barn and saddled his horse and rode to Clara Whitmore's place. He arrived without his gloves. He had forgotten them on the shelf by the door in the distracted efficiency of a man moving on necessity rather than plan. And by the time he was halfway there, it was not worth turning back. His hands, by the time he tied his horse at Clara's rail, were red in a way that had passed through painful, and arrived at the numb, swollen condition that serious cold exposure produced. He knocked on the door with the heel of his fist because his fingers did not close properly. Clara opened the door and registered his hands before she registered his face, stepping back without comment to let him enter. A wave of warm air, not the aggressive heat of an overworked stove, but the even, settled warmth of a space that had been consistently and adequately heated all day, moved past her into the cold outside. Inside a fire burning steadily, behind the grate, the stew pot on the cooktop giving off steam, the smell of wood smoke that was clean and thin rather than the acrid creosote-tinged smell that permeated most cabins running on frozen wood. He stood as close to the stove as he dared and did not put his hands near it. He knew enough to let circulation return at the temperature of the room before asking anything more of the damaged tissue in this particular discipline. The discipline of not doing the obvious thing when the obvious thing was wrong was characteristic of him, and one of the reasons he was still alive after 20 years of outdoor work in western Montana. Clara poured coffee and set it in front of him and waited. She had learned long before that silence offered men the space to say the thing they had actually come to say, rather than the thing they had rehearsed on the way over. His chest moved once before the words came. "My wood is no good, frozen through. We're burning twice the rate, and the house is still cold at night." He paused, looking at the coffee. "My youngest has been coughing for 2 days, getting worse. The cabin is cold, and it's going to stay cold because I don't have enough good wood to change that." He looked up at her. "Your chimney. I've been watching it for 3 weeks. You're burning clean and you're burning hot, and I cannot work out where the fuel is coming from because your visible supply has not changed since November." His hands had recovered enough sensation to wrap around the cup. "I'm not here because I'm curious. I'm here because my boy needs a warm house, and I don't know how to give him one right now." There was no pride in his voice. There was no absence of pride either in the way of a man performing humility. There was simply the statement of a problem by a person who had exhausted his own solutions and had come to the only remaining address. Clara looked at him for a long moment. She had been waiting for this conversation in the same way she had waited for the first frost, not with eagerness, not with dread, but with the recognition that it was coming, and that when it came, she would need to be ready with an honest answer. She told him to bring his coat. She was already putting hers on. Outside, the cold was absolute, a dry, pressing cold that found every inadequately sealed seam in a garment and moved through it with business-like efficiency. They walked together across the frozen meadow grass, their footsteps loud in the still air, and Clara did not slow her pace or look back to see if he was keeping up. At the cairn, she crouched and swept the thin surface snow away from the hatch and gripped the leather strap and lifted. The hinged planking swung up, and from the opening below came the slow exhale of air that was cool but not cold dry in the absolute specific way that enclosed earthen spaces maintained when they were built correctly. Not the dampness of a root cellar, not the mineral tang of a well shaft, but something that smelled faintly of wood and nothing else. Reardon looked into the dark opening. He said nothing for 5 full seconds, which for a man of his disposition was a significant interval. Clara descended the 5 steps and gestured once, and he followed. Inside, his eyes adjusted to the light filtering through the ventilation openings near the roof, and what they adjusted to was rows of split timber filling the chamber from floor to ceiling, stacked with the deliberate gaps of someone who understood air movement, each piece dry in a way that he had not seen dry wood look since September. He reached out and pressed his palm against the nearest log. It was lighter than it should have been. Not the leaden density of frozen wood or the slightly heavy resistance of wood that had drawn moisture. It was the weight of wood that had lost everything it was going to lose and had nothing left to give back the ideal combustion weight, the weight of fuel ready to do exactly what fuel was supposed to do. "How much is left?" His voice had dropped to something between a question and a statement, the register of a person confronting the answer to a question they had not known how to ask correctly until this moment. Clara told him 2 chords approximately having begun with 3. Reardon ran the arithmetic in his head without being asked and arrived at the same number. Clara had built the system around a quarter cord per week for a cabin of that size, with a well-maintained stove and fuel of this quality. Clean, complete, efficient. Exactly the burn rate the physics demanded when nothing was working against it. She showed him the ventilation gaps near the ceiling and explained their sizing, not a lesson, just an answer to the question she knew he would ask about how the air inside stayed dry rather than growing stagnant. She traced the angle of the floor with one hand and described the drainage principle. Water moved downhill, and she had built downhill out of the chamber. She pointed to the dense clay walls and explained what her father had taught her about that particular substrate. It held temperature the way a heavy cast iron pan held heat, slowly absorbing, slowly releasing, never reaching the extremes of what the surface experienced. She told him that at 3 feet below the frost line in this part of Montana, the earth maintained a temperature between 45 and 55 degrees regardless of what happened above it, and that this temperature was the system. The chamber was not a device, it was a room built inside a device the earth had already constructed. The wood goes in dry in October, she said, her breath just barely visible in the cool air of the chamber. The ground keeps it exactly as dry until March. You take what you need when you need it and leave the rest sealed. Every piece you burn is the same as the first piece you cut in July because nothing has touched it since July except still air and stable ground. She let that sit for a moment before adding, wood that burns at its proper temperature produces heat instead of smoke. It doesn't build creosote. It doesn't steal the energy it generates on its own melting. It just burns. Reardon turned slowly in the enclosed space, looking at the rows of timber, and the expression on his face was one she had seen before on men who had spent significant effort solving a problem by the most available method and were now confronting evidence that a different method existed, which would have required considerably less effort for considerably better results. It was not a comfortable expression. It had frustration in it and something adjacent to relief, and underneath both of those, something that might in the right light have been called respect. Why didn't you tell anyone? His voice had the flatness of genuine question. No accusation, no rhetorical ambush, just the curiosity of a man who was also a neighbor and could not entirely work out why a useful thing had been kept quiet. Clara climbed the steps and stood in the cold air outside and did not answer immediately. She closed the hatch and resettled the surface snow over it with the side of her boot and looked out across the meadow toward the wagon road. Before she spoke, would you have listened 3 months ago, when you were stacking cord after cord against your barn and your wood was dry and the season hadn't tested it yet? If I had ridden over and said, I was storing my firewood underground and that yours was going to fail in December, would you have come to see, or would you have been polite and assumed I didn't know what I was talking about? Reardon stood in the cold and thought about the conversations at the trading post in October. He thought about the widowed woman with no visible woodpile being discussed in the tone of a problem waiting to resolve itself. He thought about Edmund Holt loading half a cord onto a wagon out of pity and leaving it at her door. He thought about his own certainty those weeks ago that the situation was obvious and required no further investigation. No, he said finally, and the word was complete and unqualified. Probably not. She nodded once. The method works in any terrain where you have a stable hillside and clay subsoil. You need to get the drainage right for your specific ground. That part isn't the same everywhere, but the principle holds. She told him that on his property, the ridge behind his barn, the one that ran east to west and caught the afternoon shadow first, that was where to look. The ground there would be denser and better drained than the low section where his current stack sat. He would want to assess the slope angle before he committed to a position and check the soil composition 18 inches down before he began excavating. He was already planning the excavation in his mind. She could see it on his face, the shift from receiving information to using it that happened in practical people when they encountered a solution they could build. He asked how long alone, and she told him 2 weeks working a few hours each day, and he said 3 days with both his sons, and she said probably. He thanked her in the careful way that men thanked people who had changed the terms of a problem for them, and she received the thanks without performance, and he walked to his horse and rode back across the valley floor toward his property. Clara watched him go for a moment and then went back inside to feed the stove. 4 days later, Edmund Holt was riding the fence line along his eastern boundary, a maintenance ride he did once a week regardless of weather because fence wire contracted in extreme cold and posts heaved in freeze-thaw cycles. And a fence line left uninspected was a fence line that would fail at the worst possible time when he saw 3 figures working on the hillside behind Reardon's barn. The slope he had ridden past a dozen times without particular attention. 2 young men and an older one swinging tools at the base of the rise, the older one's movements showing the careful excavation pattern of someone who knew what angle they were working toward rather than simply removing earth. Edmund reined up and watched for a moment. Then he crossed the fence line onto Reardon's property and rode up the slope and called out. And Thomas Reardon straightened from the hole he was deepening and looked at his neighbor with the particular expression of a man who has recently been wrong about something and is not displeased to have the opportunity to discuss it. "What are you building?" Edmund's eyes moved from the excavation to the slope above it, reading the angle, noting the soil color where the mattock had cut through the surface layer to the denser material below. Reardon rested his tool and considered his answer for a moment. His son Daniel was still working the far edge of the cut, and the younger boy was moving loose earth away with a spade, and the sound of their work filled the silence, while Reardon decided how much to say. What he settled on was this: "You should go see Clara Whitmore. She'll explain it better than I can, and she's the one who ought to explain it anyway." Edmund Holt looked at the hole in the hillside. He looked at the dense clay soil that the mattock had exposed, identical in color and composition to the soil on his own property at the base of a similar rise. He looked at Thomas Reardon's face, which told him nothing he could interpret as bad news, which in the circumstances he chose to interpret as good news. He turned his horse toward the wagon road. He arrived at Clara's door that afternoon without the ropes and equipment he had carried on his last visit, without the particular anxiety of a man preparing to find catastrophe, without anything except the clean, uncomfortable openness of someone who has realized they were wrong and has ridden toward rather than away from the realization. Clara answered the door and read him the same way she read terrain, quickly, accurately, without needing to be told what she was looking at. She did not take him to the chamber immediately. She asked him first about his property, about the ground conditions, specifically because the advice she could give him depended on what he was working with, and generic instruction delivered without knowledge of the specific site was how people built systems that failed. She asked about his soil composition at depth, about the drainage patterns on his property during spring and melt, about which sections stayed wet longest after rain. Edmund answered these questions with the attention of a man being examined rather than counseled, and found himself providing specific information: the ridge at the northwest corner of his north field, the way that section drained clean through the summer, while the sections near the creek stayed boggy through June, that he had not consciously assembled into a single picture before this conversation assembled it for him. "That ridge is where you want to work," she told him, and described the angle he should be looking for in the slope, the soil test he should perform, at 18 inches to confirm the clay content, the specific adjustments he might need to make to the drainage angle if the composition was sandier than it appeared on the surface. She described the ventilation sizing in terms of the volume of the chamber rather than absolute dimensions because the right gap for a 12-foot chamber was different from the right gap for a 10-foot one. She told him about the floor pitch and the entrance positioning and the hatch construction, and she told him these things in the order in which they mattered rather than the order in which they would be performed, which was the order of someone who understood a system rather than someone who had memorized a procedure. Edmund listened to all of it, and at the end of it, he was quiet for a moment before he said, "I left wood at your door in November." He wasn't asking. He was locating the thing he needed to say in the sequence of events that had led to this conversation. She told him she remembered. "You didn't touch it." "No." "Because you didn't need it." "No." He looked down at the table for a moment and then directly at her. The apology he offered was simple and without elaboration, and she received it the same way, not as the resolution of an offense because she had never experienced his concern as an offense, but as the acknowledgement of a misreading that he had come to understand had been a misreading. She nodded, and that was sufficient. He rode home in the last light of the afternoon with a specific quality of purposefulness that came not from anger or urgency, but from having a clear task ahead of him that he understood how to begin. The temperature was already dropping as the sun descended behind the Bitterroot Range, the cold settling back into the valley floor, the way it had been settling every evening for 3 weeks without hesitation, without modulation, with the total indifference of a force that had not come for any individual and would not spare any individual who had not prepared correctly. In the chamber 30 feet from Clara's front door, 2 cords of bone-dry timber waited in 47 degrees of still, stable air. It would be there tomorrow, and it would be there in January, and it would be there in February, unchanged and unchangeable by whatever the sky produced, because it was not under the sky. It was under the earth, which was a different thing entirely. A thing that did not blizzard, that did not freeze, that did not soak through canvas or split along unexpected grain lines when a sledgehammer struck it in anger. It simply held. Reardon's excavation was 2 feet deep by nightfall. Edmund Holt had a site chosen before he reached his own gate. The valley was beginning in its slow and resistant way to learn something that the ground had always known. Reardon's chamber was finished on the 27th of December, 3 days after he had begun it, which was 1 day faster than he had estimated when he told Clara 3 days was likely. He and his 2 sons had worked in shifts through the shortened daylight hours, the older boy Daniel managing the mattock work in the forward sections, while the younger took the spoil out by the load, and the father directed both from a position inside the cut that let him read the soil composition as each new face was exposed. The clay in that section of his property ran deeper than the 18 inches Clara had described as the threshold extending down through the glacial substrate in a dense, unbroken column that took the mattock differently than looser material, did absorbing strikes with a kind of sullen resistance that slowed progress, but produced walls so stable they required minimal framing to hold their shape. Reardon took this as information rather than obstacle. He made the chamber 12 feet deep instead of 10 because the material supported it and because a freighter's relationship with storage was always governed by the same principle. The cost of more space now was always less than the cost of not enough space later. On the 3rd day after the framing was set and the ventilation gaps cut, and the hatch built from lumber he had salvaged from a collapsed outbuilding at the back of his property, he and his sons moved wood. They brought it from the frozen stack near the barn in loads carrying the pieces rather than wheeling them, because the snow between barn and hillside was too deep for a barrow, and they stacked it inside the chamber with the deliberate spacing. Clara had described the gaps that looked wasteful to someone accustomed to packing wood as densely as physics allowed, but which were not wasteful, which were the mechanism by which each piece stayed separate from every other piece in the critical dimension of air circulation. Daniel, who had not been inside the chamber before, and who approached it with the skepticism that 18-year-olds brought to their father's sudden enthusiasms, pressed his palm against the chamber wall when they were halfway through the transfer and said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "It's not cold in here." The observation was not directed at anyone in particular. It was the response of a body to information that contradicted its expectations, and his father let it land without comment because there was nothing to add to it that the chamber itself had not already said. They moved 1.25 cords of the wood that had been frozen in the outdoor stack. The wood arrived at the chamber surface, frosted its outer cells, locked its interior, still carrying the moisture of the October rains in solid form. Reardon watched over the following 5 days as the conditions inside the chamber worked on it: the 47-degree air, the absence of wind, the stability of the surrounding earth. And on the 6th day, he picked up a piece at random and felt the difference. Not fully seasoned, not what Clara had stored in October, but no longer frozen either. The ice had left it. What remained was wood that would burn without fighting the firewood, that would release heat rather than consuming it in the process of its own thawing. He moved 3 pieces of it to the cabin that evening and loaded the stove, and felt the difference in the room by midnight. Henry, who had been sleeping in the warmest corner of the main room with an extra blanket since the cough had arrived, stopped producing the wet, productive cough that had worried his father most on the 5th day after it began. By the 8th day, he was moving around the cabin, normally asking for food with the persistence of a child who had been sick and was now extremely hungry. Reardon stood in the doorway between the main room and the kitchen and watched his son eat and did not say anything, because there was nothing to say that the sound of a child eating with appetite did not say better. Edmund Holt's chamber took longer because he was working alone for the first 3 days, his sons occupied with barn repairs that could not wait, and which he did not reassign because the barn was a different kind of emergency. He worked the northwest ridge the way Clara had directed, starting at a point where the slope, angle, and soil composition were both favorable, and moving inward at the angle she had described. And he found on the 2nd day that the ridge concealed a layer of natural flagstone, about 4 feet in, that lay horizontal and flat, creating a ready-made floor for the rear section of the chamber that he would not have to build. He spent an extra afternoon leveling the flagstone with a steel bar and a light hammer, fitting the irregular pieces against each other the way a mason fit dry stack wall, and what he arrived at was a floor that drained better than poured earth and would not compact or shift over time. It cost him 3 additional days of work, but he made this trade without resentment, understanding by now that the quality of the foundation determined the quality of everything that rested on it. His hatch was the most refined construction in the valley by the time he finished 2 layers of 1-inch planking with a 3-inch gap packed with dried moss gathered from the north bank of the creek, which he had read somewhere held temperature better than open air, and proved by experiment to be correct. The interior face of the hatch staying 7 degrees warmer on a 0-degree morning than Clara's 2-layer gap design when he measured both with his palm. He covered the exterior with sod and pine bark and chinked the edges with wet clay that froze within a day, and sealed the hatch to its frame with a rigidity that required the leather strap pull to open it rather than lifting by the edge. When he stepped back and looked at the finished structure from 30 feet, he could not find it. This satisfied him in a way that was difficult to articulate, but that had something to do with the completion of a thing that had been thought through rather than improvised. Samuel Pratt came down from the north 15 miles to see Edmund's chamber in the first week of January. He was a rancher of scale, more land, more livestock, more buildings to keep warm than most of the homesteaders in the valley proper, and he had heard about the underground storage method from a freighter passing through his section, who had heard it from Reardon, who had described it to 3 different people in the week since his own chamber had been operational. Pratt arrived in the mid-morning with 2 of his hired men and spent an hour at Edmund's place asking questions that revealed him to be a person who evaluated information by testing its internal logic before accepting it. He asked about the ventilation gaps 3 different ways, probing for the point at which the answer would become inconsistent, and when it did not become inconsistent, he moved on to drainage with the same methodical skepticism. Edmund answered everything he was asked, accurately and without embellishment, and when Pratt had satisfied himself, he thanked Edmund and rode home. He was back at his own property by late afternoon, and by evening he had walked his land looking for the site that matched what Edmund had described. He found it on the south face of a long, low ridge that ran behind his main barn, the same orientation Clara had identified on her own property, south-facing, to minimize frost depth, with a dense clay subsoil that a fence post driver confirmed at 30 inches. He hired 2 men with excavation experience from a settlement 8 miles north, men who had dug irrigation channels and knew how to read soil structure for the kind of work that required the earth to support rather than simply accommodate a structure, and they began on the 9th of January. Pratt's chamber was the largest in the valley. At the time it was completed, 14 feet deep, 10 feet wide, 7 feet tall, at the center large enough to store wood for his main house. A secondary cabin where his 2 hired men lived through winter, and the bunkhouse he had built the previous summer in anticipation of expanded operations. He finished it in 5 days with 3 men working, and he moved 4 full cords underground over the following 3 days, and at the end of that he sat down with his ledger and made the calculation that he was in the habit of making at each significant operational change. What did this cost in labor and material, and what would it return? The labor cost was high for 5 days of 3 men. The material cost was low because he used salvaged timber for framing throughout. He estimated the return in fuel efficiency at the end of that first month of operation, using his burn rate from previous years as the baseline and the actual consumption from January as the comparison. And when he wrote the number down, it read 38% reduction in wood consumed for the same heat output. He looked at that number for a while. He had not expected it to be so clean. He had not expected it to be so large. He wrote underneath it, first month only, confirmed with February, and closed the ledger. In February, he confirmed it. The news about Pratt's results moved through the valley the same way all useful information moved person to person, errand to errand, the freighter route, and the trading post, and the conversations that happened at water sources and property lines where neighbors stopped to speak before continuing toward their respective tasks. It arrived at the trading post in Stevensville in the first week of February, not as a single announcement, but as an accumulation of separate references that had begun to cluster around a common subject. And it was at the trading post that the conversation that had been building since October finally reached the temperature at which it became something other than gossip. Margaret Finch was present on the morning of the 7th of February in the way that she was present most mornings near the stove with a purchase she had made 20 minutes prior and not yet taken home, engaged in the work of staying current with what the valley's people were doing and why. She had revised her position on Clara Whitmore several times over the preceding 3 months as the evidence shifted beneath her earlier certainties, and she had arrived at a version that preserved the general structure of her original judgment while accommodating the more stubborn facts. Word is she's been selling the information about the storage system, charging for the advice, which I think is reasonable. A person shouldn't have to give away what they know for nothing. Thomas Reardon was at the counter buying 16-penny nails and 2 coils of wire supplies that had nothing to do with the conversation happening at the stove and that he would have preferred to complete and depart with. But he had arrived in time to hear Margaret's version, and he stood for a moment with his back to the stove and the particular stillness of a person deciding whether a thing needs correcting. He set the nails on the counter and turned. "She hasn't sold anything." His voice was level, not cold, not heated, the voice of someone correcting a measurement. "She has not asked for a cent. She has not asked for anything at all. The method is free. The information is free. She gives it to whoever asks, and she gives it completely." The room was not large. The trading post was a functional space, not a gathering hall, and the 8 or 9 people present heard everything without effort. Carl Webb, who operated the Valley's one smithing operation and who had the kind of confident social authority that came from running the only forge for 30 miles, looked up from the catalog he had been reviewing and offered, "Either way, she did all right for herself this winter. Can't fault a person for being smart about their own situation." Reardon looked at Webb with the expression of a man who has identified that a statement is technically true and substantively insufficient. "She did more than all right for herself. She kept my son from getting sicker than he was. She built something that Edmund Holt and Samuel Pratt and 3 other families in this valley are now using because she showed them how without charging them $1 or asking for any credit. And 3 months ago, every person in this room, including me, was discussing her like she was a problem that needed solving." He picked the nails up off the counter. "I thought she didn't know what she was doing. I said so in this room in October. I was as wrong about that as it's possible to be about a thing, and I think that's worth saying plainly while I'm standing where I said the other thing." Webb looked at his catalog. Margaret Finch looked at the stove. 2 of the other men in the room nodded slightly, the minimal physical acknowledgement of people who had held the same wrong opinion and did not want to catalog the specifics but were willing to concede the general territory. Nobody argued. Nobody defended the October consensus against the January evidence. The room simply absorbed what Reardon had said and rearranged itself around it. And when he paid for his nails and left, the conversation that followed had a different quality than the conversation that had preceded him. Less declarative, more provisional. The quality of people adjusting their model of something against new information rather than the quality of people confirming what they already believed. Clara was not at the trading post that morning. She was at her property working on the exterior drainage trench that ran along the base of her chamber's hillside, which the freeze-thaw cycling of January had slightly compressed at 2 points, reducing its effectiveness at routing meltwater away from the chamber entrance. She worked with a spade in temperatures that kept the ground surface firm and the deeper clay workable, reshaping the compressed sections and packing new material along the edges where settling had created low points. This was not dramatic work. It was the kind of work that invisible systems required to stay invisible and functional, small regular corrections that prevented the accumulation of small failures into a large one. She did it with the same attention she brought to everything, checked it from the chamber entrance afterward to confirm the drainage angle, and moved on to other work. She did not know what Reardon had said at the trading post. When she learned of it later, through the ordinary means of a valley where people spoke to each other regularly, she was neither surprised nor particularly moved by it. It confirmed what she already believed about him, that he was the kind of person who corrected things that needed correcting, including himself. The visitor who arrived in the last week of February was not someone Clara had been expecting, and was not someone the Valley's informal network had prepared her for. Arthur Keene was a land surveyor contracted to the Missoula office of the Territorial Land Administration, currently engaged in a 6-week survey of the Valley Corridor in support of a planned railroad route assessment. He was 43, methodical, and had spent enough years measuring the physical facts of western Montana to have developed a genuine appreciation for the difference between what land appeared to offer and what it actually offered, a distinction that informed his professional work and his personal assessments in equal measure. He had heard about the underground wood storage system from Thomas Reardon on a survey consultation the previous week, and had asked enough questions to understand that the information he had received was secondhand and that the primary source was accessible. He arrived on horseback in the mid-afternoon and introduced himself with his name and his professional affiliation and his purpose, which was to include a description of the storage method in the technical appendix of his survey report to the Territorial Governor's Office, a document that would be read by administrators and potentially by engineers assessing the settlement infrastructure of the region. A documented improvement in fuel efficiency of 30 to 40% is the kind of information that has policy implications, he told her, standing in her doorway with his survey case under his arm. If this method becomes standard practice in the territory's settlement regions, the winter mortality and hardship figures change. That's a significant outcome. Clara listened to all of this and then looked at Keene for a long moment before she answered. "I'm not an engineer," she said. "I don't have credentials that would give a formal description weight in the kind of document you're describing." Keene told her that the method's results were its credentials. He was not interested in her professional qualifications, which was fortunate since she had none that would satisfy an institutional reader. He was interested in an accurate technical description of the chamber design, the material choices, the operating principles. He had the capacity to document these and submit them in a form that the governor's office would receive seriously. She was the source. All she needed to provide was accuracy. Clara was quiet for longer than most people would have been comfortable with in the pause following a reasonable request. When she answered, she was not being modest and she was not being evasive, and she looked at Keene directly so that he could see neither of those things in her face. "A written description of a method reads like a set of instructions," she said. "Instructions get followed mechanically by people who don't understand the principles behind the steps. If someone reads a description that says dig 10 feet deep and build 2 ventilation gaps and cut the floor to forward pitch, and they build it on the wrong soil type or in the wrong position on a slope, the system fails. And when it fails for them, they'll say the method doesn't work. But the method does work. It just requires the person using it to understand why each element is what it is, so they can adjust for their specific conditions." She looked past him at the ridge where her own chamber sat invisible under the snow. "What I can do is come to a property, look at the ground, and tell someone where to dig and what to change for what they have. That can't fail in the same way because it starts with the actual conditions rather than an imagined average." Keene stood on her porch in the February cold and examined this argument. It was not one he could dismiss because it was not rhetorical and it was not false modesty. It was an accurate assessment of the gap between written instruction and embodied knowledge. And as a man who had spent 20 years discovering that maps and territories diverged in precisely the ways that maps could not predict, he understood the argument intimately. He told her he would document what he observed and what he was told through the conversations he had with people who had already built chambers and he would note the source without overstating the documentation's comprehensiveness. Clara told him that seemed honest, which was how she evaluated most proposals against the single criterion of honesty, and offered him coffee before he rode back to his base camp near Stevensville. He accepted. They sat at her table for 20 minutes discussing the soil composition of different sections of the valley, which was information relevant to his survey work, independent of the storage question, and when he left, he had more in his notes than he had arrived with. Whether this was by design on her part, he could not determine and did not try to. April came with the authority of a thing that has been scheduled and does not require announcement. The snowpack in the high country began its descent to the creek systems in the valley floor, which had been uniformly white since November, appeared in patches. First, the dark patches of exposed south-facing ground where sun angle and soil color combined to accelerate melt, and then in long runs as the snow melt advanced from the warmer lower sections toward the colder drainage areas near the creek. The sound of the valley changed from the compressed, muffled silence of deep snow to the constant, quiet percussion of moving water, the creeks and seasonal channels filling from above and moving through the valley floor toward the Bitterroot River with the unhurried purpose of water that has somewhere to go. Clara opened her chamber for the final time that season on a Tuesday morning in the second week of April, when the meadow grass around the cairn was showing its first green at the base of last year's brown stalks, and the temperature at 7 in the morning was 29 degrees and rising. She swept a thin crust of granular late-season ice from the hatch surface and lifted it and went below. The chamber contained approximately 1.25 cords of split timber. She stood in the familiar cool and looked at what remained and ran the final accounting 3 cords stored in October, 1.5 consumed across the full winter, which resolved to 1/4 cord per week for 22 weeks of consistent stove operation in temperatures that had included the extreme cold of December 15th and the weeks of sustained sub-zero conditions that had followed it. Not one piece of the remaining wood had gone to waste through moisture or decay or inefficient combustion. Not one piece had stolen heat from the cabin to accomplish its own thawing. Every log she had burned as designed at the temperature it was designed for, producing the heat it was designed to produce. The system had performed exactly as the arithmetic had predicted it would, because systems built on accurate principles did not surprise you. They confirmed you. She ran her hand along the nearest row of logs as she had run her hand along the logs in Elias Garnett's chamber in Michigan when she was 13, and the sensation was the same, dry, all the way through, light, carrying no burden but its own material. Garnett had died in 1871. She had learned this from her father in a letter received the following spring, the kind of letter that arrived after the fact to confirm what distance had already made real. He had been 68 when she met him, and he had lived another 14 years in that Michigan hillside country, which meant he had maintained his chamber through at least 20 winters after the one she had seen it in, and the people who took over his property when he was gone had either inherited his knowledge or lost it, and she had no way of knowing which. What she knew was that the knowledge had survived the transit from Michigan to Montana by living inside her, in the specific physical memory of her palm against his dry logs on a September evening 21 years ago, and that it had arrived intact and functional and capable of being passed on. She climbed back up into the April morning and closed the hatch one last time that season and stood for a moment looking toward the wagon road where she had been visible to her neighbors all winter without being understood. The understanding had come eventually. It had come through necessity rather than through argument, which was how most real understanding arrived, not through the persuasiveness of an explanation, but through the unpersuasiveness of reality operating without it. The valley that spring had a different texture than the valley the previous spring. On 4 properties in the Bitterroot Valley, excavations had been dug into hillsides and chambers built, and wood stored underground through the winter that had just passed. And the families on those properties were beginning their spring accounting from a different position than they had occupied in previous years. Reardon had fuel left over, a quarter cord surplus that he would carry into next season rather than beginning from zero. Edmund Holt's surplus was smaller, but his chamber's construction was more refined, and he was already thinking about a second larger chamber to serve the barn heating requirements he had been managing with outdoor storage since he built the structure. Pratt, working at rancher scale, had documented a fuel savings that in dollar terms represented a meaningful fraction of his annual operating costs. And he was commissioning 2 of his men to build a second chamber on the far side of his property before the summer construction season ended. Arthur King completed his survey report in April and included in its technical appendix a 2-paragraph description of underground wood storage as practiced in the Bitterroot Valley, noting the approximate fuel efficiency improvement and the soil composition requirements and the general operating principles, without attributing the method to any specific source, because his documentation of those details was incomplete. He submitted the report to the Territorial Governor's Office in Missoula. The report was read by 2 administrators and filed. One of the administrators mentioned the fuel storage section to a colleague who was working on a separate assessment of winter preparedness in territorial settlements, and that colleague noted it in her own working documents. And the information moved through institutional channels in the slow and often untraceable way that practical knowledge moved through institutions, not cited, not credited, not particularly celebrated, but present, and available to the next person who went looking for it. In the autumn of 1879, on a morning when the frost had begun silvering the meadow grass at dawn, but the days were still warm enough to work in shirt sleeves, by afternoon there was a knock at Clara's door. She answered it to find a girl of 16 standing on the step, with the specific posture of someone who has decided to ask for something and has decided in advance not to apologize for asking. Her name was Abigail Foster. Her family had arrived from Indiana the previous spring, her father drawn by the land availability in the valley's southern section, and they had settled on 40 acres of ground that was workable, but that her father, who had fallen seriously ill in July, had not been able to work adequately through the summer. Her mother was managing as well as a woman could manage an unfamiliar homestead with an ill husband and 3 younger children, which was to say barely. They had cut and stacked what wood they could, which was not enough for a Montana winter. And they had begun receiving advice from neighbors, and the advice from Thomas Reardon had included a description of the underground storage method and a direction: go speak to Clara Whitmore before the ground freezes. Abigail had not come to ask for wood. Clara saw this clearly in the way she stood, not the posture of someone requesting charity, which bent slightly toward the person being asked, but the posture of someone requesting information, which stood straight toward it. "I want to know how to build the kind of storage you built," Abigail said, her voice carrying the directness of someone who had prepared what she needed to say and was not going to approach it indirectly. "I can do the digging. My brother is 18 and strong. I need to know where and how." Clara looked at this girl, 16, standing straight on her step, asking for knowledge, rather than for the product of knowledge, and felt something move through her that was not sentimentality and was not quite recognition, but existed in the vicinity of both. She did not answer immediately. She got her coat, which was the answer. They walked to the Foster property together that afternoon, 3 miles south through country that had dried enough in the autumn air to make walking pleasant. And Clara looked at the terrain with the same reading eye her father had developed over decades of measuring land and had transferred to her through years of watching him do it. The Foster ground was different from her own, more rock at the surface, the meadow section sitting above a substrate that was gravel heavy in the top 2 feet before it hit the denser material she needed. She walked the eastern edge of the property, where a low ridge broke the otherwise flat ground, and crouched at several points and pushed a tent stake into the soil and noted the resistance at each depth. She found what she was looking for near the ridge's southern end, where the gravel thinned and the clay increased, and the slope angle provided natural drainage without requiring the aggressive trench work her own ground had needed. She told Abigail and her brother precisely where to put the entrance, precisely what angle to cut the floor, precisely how large to make the ventilation gaps for a chamber of the size they needed, smaller than Clara's, given their requirements, but proportioned correctly for those requirements. She described the hatch construction in specific terms, the material choices and the fastening method, and the importance of the side cover's seal against the frame. She described the common mistakes: positioning too close to the water table, cutting ventilation gaps too large, and pulling outdoor air in pitching the floor incorrectly, and creating a drain trap rather than a drain. She watched Abigail take this in with the focused economy of a person who was converting information directly into plan without the intermediate step of skepticism. How long to build? Abigail's hands were already in the approximate position of a person holding a mattock, her body's way of beginning the work before the work started. Clara told her a week, perhaps less, with 2 people who knew what they were working toward. Abigail's brother confirmed he could give 5 days. They began the following morning. Clara came twice during the construction to check the work and answer questions. Once, when they hit an unexpected rock formation at the ventilation gap location that required a small adjustment to the chamber's orientation, and once when the hatch framing was being set and the angle needed correction. Both times she gave specific guidance rather than general encouragement, which was what the situation required and what Abigail received without the need for it to be framed as anything other than engineering. The chamber was 8 feet deep rather than 10 because the favorable soil ended at that point, but within those dimensions it was built correctly with the floor angle and the drainage orientation and the ventilation sizing, and all calibrated to the specific conditions of the site. It would hold 1.5 cords, which was what the Foster household needed. They filled it in the second week of October, the wood going in dry from the summer's seasoning, and Clara checked it one final time and found nothing that needed adjustment. Standing in the low entry shaft, looking at the stacked timber in the cool, still air, she told Abigail, "The one thing this teaches you, if you let it, is to look at the ground before you look at the problem. The ground usually has more to offer than the problem suggests." Abigail looked at her with the expression of someone receiving an idea that was immediately useful in several contexts simultaneously. Clara took this as sufficient and went home. The winter of 1879 into 1880 was less severe than the preceding year. Temperatures stayed manageable through most of December and January, with only 1 week of the grinding below zero cold that had characterized the previous season's worst stretch. This mildness was not relevant to the question of whether the underground storage method worked, because the method did not depend on the severity of the winter for its effectiveness. It depended on the stability of the earth and the dryness of the wood, both of which were independent of what the sky was doing in any given year. What the milder winter did was allow people to see the efficiency improvement clearly, not as relief from a crisis as the previous year's results had been, but as simple, undramatic improvement in the ordinary management of a household fuel supply. Less consumption for the same heat, less time managing the stove, no chimney maintenance problems traceable to fuel quality. The improvement was quiet, the way all genuine improvements were quiet once they became the baseline condition and stopped being something to recover toward. By the end of that second winter, the underground chamber was no longer notable in the Bitterroot Valley in the way that new and unconventional things were notable. It had crossed the threshold from unusual to unremarkable, which was where useful things belonged and where they did their best work. 6 families had chambers of various sizes. 3 more were planned for the coming autumn. The trading post conversations had stopped including it as a topic because it had ceased to be a story and had become a practice, and practices did not generate conversation the way stories did. In 1882, Reardon added a second chamber on the north end of his property, larger than the first, position to serve the expanded operation he had been building toward for 2 years. His son Daniel managed the construction largely independently, making one minor drainage adjustment based on the specific hydrology of the north site and one ventilation modification based on the chamber's greater volume. Both adjustments arrived at through the same reasoning Clara had used, and neither requiring consultation because the principles were understood rather than memorized. This was how knowledge became embedded in a community, not as a set of rules applied uniformly, but as a way of thinking that could be applied variably to variable conditions by people who had internalized the logic behind the rules. In 1884, Abigail Foster, 21 now and recently married, moved with her husband to a homestead 20 miles east of her family's land and country that was higher and rockier and colder, and where the winters were, by local account, more serious than the valley floor. The first thing she and her husband did after they had the cabin habitable was walk the property and find the hillside. She assessed the soil composition and the slope angle and the drainage patterns with the practiced eye of someone who had learned to read terrain for a specific purpose, and she identified the right location on a November morning when the ground was still workable. Her husband, a quiet man who had learned early in their marriage that his wife's assessments of physical problems were usually accurate and worth implementing without extended deliberation, helped her excavate the chamber over 2 weeks of morning work before the frost locked the topsoil. They filled it that same autumn and spent the winter in a part of Montana where the cold had a different severity than the valley floor, and their stove burned clean, and their chimney stayed clear, and they did not run short of fuel. In 1887, a short notice appeared in the Missoula Gazette, noting that settlers in the Bitterroot region had developed practical innovations in fuel storage that had materially improved winter preparedness across multiple properties. The notice was 3 sentences long, not attributed to any source, and ran below an advertisement for a hardware supplier in Missoula and above a legal notice regarding a property survey. Nobody at the trading post in Stevensville read it aloud or discussed it. Nobody needed to. Clara Whitmore sold her homestead in the spring of 1889 to a couple from Wisconsin, Daniel and Ruth Ashford, 26 and 24 respectively, recently married and newly committed to the project of building something in the West that would be theirs in a way that rented rooms in Milwaukee had never been. The land broker who showed them the property walked them across the meadow in a march that still had snow in the low points and pointed out the various features: the cabin's sound construction, the shed with the repaired roof, the good southern exposure of the kitchen garden site. At the base of the east hillside, he pointed to a flat section of ground with a particular surface texture, the sod slightly different from the surrounding meadow grass, greener in patches as if it had been placed rather than grown, and told them that was a wood storage chamber underground built by the previous owner. Several of the neighboring properties have them, he said. It's a fairly common approach in this part of the valley. Works well from what the neighbors say. Ruth Ashford crouched at the edge of the surface and ran her hand across the sod and found the frame of the hatch underneath the outline of it, visible if you knew to look. She gripped the leather strap, still sound, still attached, the doubled stitching holding against 11 seasons of use, and lifted. The hatch swung up, and the cool, dry air exhaled from below, the faint smell of wood and earth and something she could not name, but that smelled, she would think later, like competence. It smelled like a decision someone had made correctly and maintained over time. Daniel looked into the opening and then at his wife and asked whether she thought they should try to understand it before they used it. Ruth let the hatch down carefully and stood and looked at the hillside and the cabin 30 feet away and the wagon road beyond it, and her answer was one that contained a year's worth of practical philosophy in a single sentence. We understand it well enough to fill it. We'll understand the rest by spring. She was right. By the following April, she could have explained the principles of subsurface temperature stability and passive ventilation to anyone who asked, because she had spent a winter observing how the system behaved under the range of conditions a Montana winter provided, and had applied the same intelligence to understanding it that she brought to every other physical system that governed her household. She asked Edmund Holt about the drainage considerations on their specific site in November, and Thomas Reardon about the ventilation adjustment for the slight change in chamber volume she was considering, and Arthur Keene's still working survey contracts in the region about the geological context that made the clay substrate perform the way it did. She received all of this information directly and incorporated it and did not need to receive it twice. The Ashfords maintained the chamber through 20 years of occupancy, adjusting the drainage trench twice and replacing the hatch once when the planking showed the first signs of surface weathering, and they expanded the chamber's effective volume by 8 cubic feet in 1903 by deepening the back section when their household grew to include a third child, and the fuel requirement increased accordingly. When they eventually built a proper wood barn in 1907, with a dedicated dry storage section ventilated through the roof, they did not demolish the chamber. They kept it operational as a secondary system for the kind of wood they wanted to season slowly and store at guaranteed stable conditions, because the chamber's performance compared to barn storage remained measurably superior in the specific dimension that mattered most: fuel efficiency at the point of combustion. In 1909, on a property 12 miles north of the old Whitmore homestead, a 19-year-old named James Ashford, who had grown up hearing his parents discuss drainage angles and ventilation sizing and the specific clay content of different sections of their land, the way other children heard their parents discuss crop rotation and cattle breeding, was explaining to two friends who had recently established their own homesteads how to find the right site for an underground wood chamber. He was drawing in the dirt with a stick indicating slope angle and showing the relationship between water table depth and chamber position, referring to the dense clay substrate as the key variable in describing the ventilation sizing in terms of chamber volume, with the casual precision of someone for whom this was not interesting knowledge but simply accurate knowledge, the kind you passed on because it was useful. He did not mention Clara Whitmore's name. He did not know it. He knew that his parents had learned from neighbors, and that the neighbors had learned from whoever had originally built the chamber on the Whitmore property, and that the original builder had moved away before his parents arrived. The name had not survived the transit through time and distance that the method had survived, which was the way of most things that traveled from person to person across years. The name dropped off, the substance continued. The two young homesteaders listened and asked questions and took what they needed from the explanation and added it to what they already knew. which was how knowledge moved when it was the right kind of knowledge, not as a monument to its origin, but as a tool that passed through hands and remained functional, regardless of whose hands were currently holding it. 30 feet from the old cabin door that Clara had passed through 10,000 times, the hatch still sat in the hillside under a covering of meadow grass that had grown back so completely over 11 years that even people who knew it was there sometimes had to look twice to find it. The leather strap inside the one Clara had attached herself in October of 1878 had been replaced once by Ruth Ashford in 1901 with a doubled strip of harness leather and copper rivets that made a better job of it than the original. The rock pile cairn stood beside it, 3 stones, as it had always been chosen for practicality rather than appearance, which was how Clara had chosen everything in her life that she built to last. Under snow, it was the thing you look for. In clear weather, it was simply part of the hillside unremarkable present doing its quiet and permanent work. Some solutions built correctly and maintained honestly outlasted the names attached to them. This was not a failure of memory. It was the most durable form of success, the kind that kept working long after the person who made it had moved on to other problems in other places under other skies.